The morning sun cast long shadows across the remote mountains of Afghanistan as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her headset in the cockpit of her MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. The radio crackled with urgent communications from the forward operating base, but the message she was hearing made her blood run cold. Wildcard 6, this is command. We have 180 Navy SEALs trapped behind enemy lines in the Korengal Valley. Heavy Taliban presence surrounding their position. All extraction attempts have failed. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly. Storm front moving in from the west. Sarah gripped the cyclic control tighter as she processed the information. 180 of America's most elite warriors, trapped in what military strategists call the Valley of Death for good reason. The Korengal Valley had claimed more American lives than any other location in Afghanistan. Its steep terrain and network of caves providing perfect cover for enemy fighters. Copy that, command, she responded in her microphone. What's the extraction plan? The pause on the other end told her everything she needed to know before the words came through. Negative on extraction, wildcard 6. All helicopter assets are grounded due to incoming weather. Ground support is 12 hours out minimum. SEALs are ordered to hold position and wait for conditions to improve. Sarah stared out at the horizon where dark storm clouds were building like a wall of destruction. 12 hours might as well be 12 days for the trap forces. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban reinforcements were moving into the area from 3 different directions. The SEALs had been conducting a classified counterterrorism operation when they had been surrounded during the night. Now, as dawn broke, they found themselves cut off from any hope of immediate rescue. The helicopter pilot had been flying rescue missions in Afghanistan for 3 years. She had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles, extracted special forces teams from hostile territory, and delivered supplies to remote outposts under enemy fire. But she had never faced a situation quite like this one. The weather was deteriorating by the minute, with wind speeds already approaching the maximum safe operating limits for her aircraft. Wildcard 6, you are ordered to return to base immediately, came the voice of Colonel Roberts, the base commander. Weather conditions are becoming too dangerous for flight operations. All aircraft are grounded until further notice. Sarah looked at her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, who had been flying with her for over a year. They had developed an almost telepathic understanding during their time together, and she could see in his eyes that he was thinking the same thing she was. Those SEALs wouldn't survive 12 hours in that valley with Taliban forces closing in from all sides. Sir, with respect, there might be a window of opportunity before the storm hits, Sarah transmitted back. My bird is fueled and ready. I can make it to the valley and back before the worst of the weather arrives. Negative, Captain Mitchell. That's a direct order. Return to base immediately. We cannot afford to lose a helicopter and crew in addition to the ground forces. The SEALs are highly trained and equipped to hold their position until proper extraction can be arranged. Sarah knew the colonel was right from a strategic standpoint. Losing a helicopter and its crew would only make the situation worse. But she also knew something that the brass sitting safely in their command bunkers didn't understand. She had been studying weather patterns in this region for months, and she knew that this particular storm system was going to be worse than the meteorologists were predicting. Much worse. The trapped SEALs were part of SEAL Team 6, the same unit that had taken down Osama bin Laden. They had been conducting a highly classified operation to capture or kill a high-value Taliban target known as the Ghost, a bomb maker responsible for dozens of attacks on coalition forces. The mission had been planned for weeks, with extensive intelligence gathering and surveillance. Everything had gone perfectly until about 4 in the morning, when the SEALs had found themselves walking into what appeared to be a carefully planned ambush. Someone had tipped off the Taliban about the operation. Now, instead of celebrating the capture of a key enemy leader, the most elite soldiers in the American military were fighting for their survival in hostile territory. Sarah's radio crackled again with updates from the trap forces. Command, this is Bravo 6. Enemy count appears to be over 300 fighters moving into position around our perimeter. We have adequate ammunition for sustained firefight, but request immediate extraction. Repeat, we need immediate extraction. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the leader of the Trap SEAL team. Sarah had met him briefly during a previous mission, and she knew him to be one of the most capable and level-headed officers in the Special Operations community. If Morrison was requesting immediate extraction, the situation was genuinely desperate. Bravo 6, command copies your transmission. Maintain defensive positions. Help is coming. Weather conditions currently preventing helicopter operations. Estimate 12 hours until extraction possible. Sarah could hear the frustration in Morrison's response. Command, with respect, we may not have 12 hours. Enemy is moving heavy weapons into position. We can hold them off for a while, but they have the high ground and superior numbers. The pilot made a decision that would either save 180 lives or cost her everything she had worked for in her military career. She switched to a private channel that only her co-pilot could hear. Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said quietly. I'm going to give you a choice. You can order me to turn this bird around and head back to base, and I'll follow that order. Or you can trust me when I tell you that those SEALs are going to die if we don't act right now. Lieutenant Thompson looked at her for a long moment, then glanced out at the approaching storm clouds. What are you thinking, Sarah? I'm thinking that we have maybe 90 minutes before this storm makes flying impossible. I'm thinking that we know this valley better than anyone else in the squadron because we've flown over it 100 times. And I'm thinking that 180 Navy SEALs deserve better than being abandoned because some colonel is worried about losing a helicopter. Thompson nodded slowly. You know, they'll court-martial us if we disobey direct orders. They'll court-martial me, Sarah corrected. You're the co-pilot. I'll take full responsibility. But I need to know that you're with me on this because I can't do it alone. The two pilots looked at each other in silence as the helicopter continued flying through the morning sky. Below them, the rugged mountains of Afghanistan stretched out in all directions, hiding countless dangers and secrets. Somewhere in those mountains, 180 of America's finest warriors were surrounded by enemies who would show them no mercy if they were captured. Thompson reached over and began adjusting settings on his control panel. What's our approach going to be? Sarah felt a surge of relief and gratitude toward her co-pilot. Low and fast through the southern approach. The storm is coming from the west, so we'll have about 15 minutes of cover from the cloud cover before visibility goes to zero. We extract as many as we can in the first trip, then assess whether we can make a second run. And if command tries to order us back during the mission, then we experience some very convenient radio trouble. Sarah switched her radio back to the main command frequency. Command, this is Wildcard 6. Experiencing some communication difficulties. Signal breaking up. We'll maintain current heading until communications are restored. She immediately switched the radio to a different frequency, effectively cutting off communication with the base until she decided to restore it. It was a technique that pilots sometimes used in combat situations when they needed to make split-second decisions without interference from higher command. The helicopter changed course, turning toward the distant mountains where 180 Navy SEALs were fighting for their lives. Behind them, the storm clouds continued building, creating a wall of darkness that would soon engulf the entire region. Sarah checked her instruments one more time, calculating fuel consumption, flight time, and the dozens of other variables that would determine whether this rescue mission succeeded or became a disaster. She thought about her family back home in Texas, about the letter she had written to her parents before her deployment explaining why she had chosen to become a military pilot. She thought about all the training exercises and simulations that had prepared her for moments like this. Most of all, she thought about the 180 men who were counting on someone, somewhere, to refuse to abandon them. The helicopter flew deeper into hostile territory, carrying two pilots who had just made the most important decision of their lives. The terrain below changed from rolling hills to jagged peaks as Sarah guided the Black Hawk deeper into the Karangal Valley. Through her night vision goggles, she could see muzzle flashes scattered across the mountainsides like deadly fireflies. The battle was already underway, and from the intensity of the gunfire, it was clear that the SEALs were heavily outnumbered. Bravo 6, this is Wildcard 6. Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency that special operations teams use for helicopter coordination. I'm 5 minutes out from your position. Need immediate update on landing zone situation. The response came back immediately, filled with the background noise of automatic weapons fire and explosions. Wildcard 6, what are you doing here? Command said all aircraft were grounded. Sometimes Command doesn't have all the information, Sarah replied diplomatically. What's your tactical situation down there? Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice was tight with concentration as he coordinated the defense of his position while talking to the incoming helicopter. We're holding a ridgeline about 2 clicks north of the original target building. Taliban forces have us surrounded on 3 sides. The only clear approach is from the south, but it's under direct observation from enemy positions on the high ground. Sarah studied her tactical display, which showed the topography of the area in detail. The landing zone that Morrison was describing was essentially a death trap. Any helicopter trying to land there would be exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions, with no cover and no escape route if things went wrong. Copy that, Bravo 6. I see the problem. What about the alternative landing zone we discussed in the briefing? There was a pause before Morrison responded. Negative on alternative LZ. Taliban moved heavy machine guns into position there about 30 minutes ago. We tried to clear them out, but took casualties in the attempt. Sarah felt her heart sink. The backup landing zone had been their best hope for a safe extraction. Without it, any rescue attempt would require landing directly in the middle of a firefight, something that violated every rule in the helicopter pilot's handbook. Lieutenant Thompson was monitoring communications with the base while Sarah focused on the tactical situation. Sarah, we've got a problem. Command figured out that our radio troubles weren't real. Colonel Roberts is demanding that we return to base immediately. He's threatening to scramble F-16s to escort us back. The threat of fighter jets being sent to force them back to base was serious. Sarah knew that the colonel wasn't bluffing, and that continuing with the mission could result in her being treated as a rogue pilot operating without authorization. But she also knew that turning back now would doom the trapped SEALs. How long before they can get fighters in the air? She asked. Maybe 20 minutes, assuming they're already fueled and armed. But the storm is getting worse. I don't think they'll be able to fly in these conditions much longer. Through the windscreen, Sarah could see that the storm clouds were now directly overhead. Lightning was beginning to flash in the distance, and the wind was buffeting the helicopter more severely with each passing minute. Flying in these conditions was extremely dangerous, even for experienced pilots with advanced aircraft. The radio crackled with another transmission from the trapped SEALs. Wildcard 6, be advised that enemy forces are moving rocket-propelled grenade teams into position around the perimeter. If you're coming in, it needs to be now before they can get those weapons sighted in. RPGs were the helicopter pilot's worst nightmare. Unlike small arms fire, which the Black Hawk's armor could withstand to some extent, a rocket-propelled grenade could bring down even the most advanced helicopter with a single hit. The fact that the Taliban was moving these weapons into position meant that they were specifically preparing for a helicopter rescue attempt. Bravo 6, I need you to listen very carefully, Sarah transmitted. I'm going to attempt an extraction, but it's going to have to be fast, and we're only going to get one chance. I need you to select your most critically wounded personnel for the first lift. We'll take as many as we can, but the bird can only carry so much weight in these conditions. Understood, Wildcard 6. We have 8 wounded personnel, 3 critical, 5 walking wounded. Priority is getting the critical cases out first. 8 wounded men. Sarah quickly calculated weight and space limitations in her head. The Black Hawk could normally carry about 11 fully equipped soldiers, but the wounded would require additional space for medical equipment and stretchers. In the current weather conditions, with the need for extra fuel reserves, she estimated she could safely extract maybe 6 or 7 personnel maximum. Bravo 6, prepare for immediate extraction of 6 personnel. I'll come back for the rest after I get the wounded to safety. Negative wildcard 6. Weather is deteriorating too rapidly for multiple trips. If you leave now, you won't be able to make it back. We extract everyone together or no one gets out. Sarah understood Morrison's position, but she also understood the physics of helicopter flight. There was simply no way to safely extract 180 personnel in a single lift with one helicopter. It would require multiple trips, and the weather was making that impossible. Bravo 6, be realistic. I can't carry everyone at once. Let me get your wounded out first, then we'll figure out the rest. Wildcard 6, with respect, we don't abandon our people. If you can't take everyone, then you need to leave and come back when you have adequate resources. It was exactly the response Sarah had expected from a SEAL team leader, and exactly the response that was going to get everyone killed. The SEALs operated under a code that no one gets left behind, but sometimes tactical reality made that code impossible to follow. Lieutenant Thompson was monitoring the radio traffic between their helicopter and the base. Sarah, command is going crazy. They're demanding to know our exact location. Colonel Roberts is personally threatening to have us arrested the moment we land. Let them threaten, Sarah replied. We'll deal with the consequences later. She began her approach toward the landing zone, flying low through the valleys to avoid detection by enemy forces on the high ground. The landscape below was a maze of rocky ridges and deep ravines, perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare, but terrible terrain for helicopter operations. As they got closer to the battle area, the sound of gunfire became audible even over the noise of the helicopter's engines. Tracer rounds were streaking through the darkness like deadly fireworks, and occasional explosions lit up the mountainsides. The SEALs were holding their position, but it was clear that they were under tremendous pressure. Wildcard 6, enemy forces are attempting to flank our position from the east, Morrison reported. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they complete the maneuver. After that, our position becomes untenable. 10 minutes. Sarah knew she could reach the landing zone in less than 5 minutes, but actually completing an extraction would take much longer. Loading wounded personnel onto a helicopter under fire was a slow and dangerous process, especially when the landing zone was exposed to enemy observation. Bravo 6, I'm going to try something unconventional. Instead of landing at your position, I'm going to hover about 50 feet above the ridgeline. You'll need to fast rope your personnel up to the helicopter using climbing equipment. It's dangerous, but it might be our only option. Fast roping in reverse. Having personnel climb up to a hovering helicopter instead of rappelling down from one was an extremely difficult and dangerous maneuver. It required exceptional physical conditioning and climbing skills, exactly the kind of abilities that Navy SEALs possessed. But attempting it with wounded personnel in the middle of a firefight would be pushing the limits of what was possible. Wildcard 6, that's a hell of a plan. Give me 2 minutes to coordinate with my team leaders. While Morrison discussed the plan with his subordinates, Sarah continued approaching the battle area. Through her night vision goggles, she could now see individual fighters moving among the rocks and trees. The Taliban forces appeared to be well organized and well equipped, suggesting that this ambush had been carefully planned in advance. Lightning flashed overhead, followed seconds later by a rumble of thunder that shook the helicopter. The storm was getting closer, and soon the lightning would make flying too dangerous to continue. Lightning strikes were another nightmare scenario for helicopter pilots, capable of causing electrical system failures or even structural damage. Wildcard 6, Bravo 6. We've discussed your plan. My team leaders think it's crazy, but they're willing to try it. We'll start with the wounded personnel first, then move to the rest of the team. Copy that, Bravo 6. Beginning final approach now. Mark your position with infrared strobes so I can identify the exact pickup point. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah could see several infrared lights begin flashing on the ridgeline below. The lights were invisible to the naked eye, but showed up clearly on night vision equipment, allowing the helicopter crew to identify the SEAL position without revealing it to enemy forces. As they approached the pickup point, tracer rounds began streaking past the helicopter. The Taliban had spotted them despite their efforts at stealth, and enemy fighters were opening fire with everything they had. The sound of bullets striking the helicopter's armor was like hail on a metal roof, a constant drumming that reminded Sarah just how dangerous their situation had become. Taking fire from multiple positions, Thompson reported, his voice steady despite the circumstances. No major damage so far, but we've got warning lights on the hydraulic system. Hydraulic problems were serious in any aircraft, but potentially catastrophic in a helicopter. Without proper hydraulic pressure, the controls would become extremely difficult to operate, making precision flying nearly impossible. How bad is it? Sarah asked while maneuvering the helicopter into position above the SEAL position. Still within acceptable parameters, but it's getting worse. We need to make this fast. The helicopter reached the pickup point, and Sarah began the delicate process of hovering directly above the ridgeline while under enemy fire. Below her, she could see Navy SEALs moving with practiced efficiency, preparing ropes and organizing the wounded personnel for evacuation. The first wounded SEAL began his climb up the rope toward the hovering helicopter as enemy fire intensified around them. Sarah fought to keep the Black Hawk steady in the increasingly violent wind while bullets sparked off the aircraft's armored hull. Through her night vision goggles, she could see the determined expression on the wounded soldier's face as he pulled himself hand over hand up the 50 feet of rope, despite what appeared to be a serious leg wound. Come on, Thompson muttered under his breath as he monitored their fuel levels and the helicopter systems. The hydraulic warning light was now flashing red, indicating that they were operating on backup systems. Sarah, we've got maybe 5 more minutes before we need to abort this hover. Below them, the SEALs had organized themselves into a human chain, with the strongest team members helping to push the wounded personnel up the ropes. It was an incredible display of teamwork and physical conditioning, but it was also agonizingly slow. At their current rate, it would take nearly an hour to evacuate all 180 men, and they simply didn't have that much time. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the helicopter's tail rotor, missing by less than 10 feet. The explosion against the rocky mountainside lit up the night sky and sent shrapnel flying in all directions. Sarah felt the helicopter shudder from the blast wave, and several new warning lights appeared on her instrument panel. "That was too close," she said into her microphone. "Bravo 6, the enemy is getting our range with those RPGs. We need to move this along faster." Lieutenant Commander Morrison's response was strained as he coordinated the evacuation while returning fire at attacking Taliban forces. "Doing our best, Wildcard 6. First wounded is almost to your position." The wounded SEAL reached the helicopter's cabin door, where the crew chief and medic were waiting to pull him inside. Despite his injuries, the man had made the climb in less than 3 minutes, a feat that would have been impressive under normal circumstances, but was extraordinary under combat conditions. "1 down, 7 wounded to go," Thompson reported. "But at this rate, we're going to run out of fuel before we get everyone out." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that leaving wounded men behind wasn't an option. She began calculating alternative approaches in her head, trying to find a way to speed up the evacuation process without compromising safety. A second RPG exploded even closer to the helicopter, this time close enough that the blast wave actually pushed the aircraft sideways. Sarah fought to regain control as warning alarms began sounding in the cockpit. The proximity of the explosion had damaged some of the helicopter's electronic systems, and she could feel the controls becoming less responsive. "Engine temperature is climbing rapidly," Thompson reported, his voice now showing the strain of their situation. "We've got debris in the air intake from that last explosion. If the engine overheats, we're going down whether we want to or not." The second wounded SEAL was halfway up the rope when disaster struck. A Taliban fighter with an AK-47 managed to get close enough to the landing zone to fire directly at the climbing soldier. Sarah watched in horror as the SEAL's body jerked from the impact of multiple bullets, but somehow the man continued climbing. "Bravo 6, your man on the rope is hit, but still climbing." Can you provide covering fire on that position to the northeast? Roger, wildcard 6. Engaging. The response from the SEALs was immediate and devastating. A coordinated barrage of gunfire erupted from their position, directed at the Taliban fighter who had shot their teammate. The enemy fire from that direction ceased abruptly, but Sarah knew it was only temporary. There were too many attackers and too much open ground for the SEALs to cover. The wounded SEAL reached the helicopter cabin, blood streaming from fresh wounds but still conscious and alert. As the crew chief and medic pulled him inside, he immediately began helping to prepare equipment for the next evacuee. It was exactly the kind of selfless courage that Sarah had come to expect from special operations personnel. Wildcard 6, be advised we have heavy equipment moving up the valley from the south, Morrison reported. Looks like armored vehicles, possibly with mounted weapons. ETA about 15 minutes to effective range. Armored vehicles would change the tactical situation completely. Heavy machine guns mounted on trucks or armored cars could engage the helicopter for much longer range than individual fighters with small arms. Once those vehicles arrived, continuing the evacuation would become suicidal. Copy that, Bravo 6. We need to accelerate this process. Can you send up multiple climbers simultaneously? Negative, wildcard 6. The ropes aren't rated for that much weight, and we can't risk having climbers fall. We're moving as fast as safely possible. Sarah understood the safety concerns, but she also understood that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The storm was getting worse. Their helicopter was taking damage. Enemy reinforcements were arriving, and fuel was running low. Something had to give, and she was afraid it was going to be the mission. Lightning flashed directly overhead, so close that the electromagnetic pulse temporarily interfered with the helicopter's radio systems. The thunder that followed was deafening, and Sarah could feel the electrical charge in the air, making her skin crawl. Flying in lightning was extremely dangerous, but landing in their current situation would be even more dangerous. Sarah, we need to make a decision, Thompson said quietly. We can maybe get 2 or 3 more wounded out before we have to leave. After that, we won't have enough fuel to make it back to base. The third wounded SEAL was now climbing the rope, moving more slowly than the previous 2 due to what appeared to be injuries to both arms. Sarah could see that he was struggling, but the man refused to give up. Below him, his teammates were providing encouragement and covering fire, doing everything they could to help their wounded comrade reach safety. A new voice came over the radio, one that Sarah recognized as belonging to Colonel Roberts back at the base. Wildcard 6, this is command. You are ordered to abort your current mission immediately and return to base. You are operating without authorization and putting lives at risk with your reckless actions. Sarah looked at Thompson, who shrugged and reached for the radio controls. Command, this is Wildcard 6. Still experiencing communication difficulties. Signal breaking up. Unable to receive your transmission clearly. It was a transparent fiction, but it bought them a few more minutes. Sarah knew that eventually they would have to answer for their actions, but right now the only thing that mattered was getting as many wounded SEALs out as possible. The third wounded man reached the helicopter cabin, where willing hands pulled him inside. That left 5 more wounded personnel still on the ground, plus 173 healthy but trapped SEALs. The mathematics of the situation were grim, but Sarah wasn't ready to give up yet. Bravo 6, I'm going to try something different. Instead of hovering in place, I'm going to land on that ridgeline for 30 seconds. Load as many wounded as you can in that time, then I'll take off again. Wildcard 6, that ridgeline isn't suitable for landing. Too narrow and too much slope. You'll never be able to maintain stability. Let me worry about the flying. Just be ready to move fast when I touch down. It was an incredibly risky maneuver, attempting to land a large helicopter on a narrow mountain ridge in high winds while under enemy fire. But it was the only way to speed up the evacuation process enough to make a real difference. Sarah began her descent toward the ridgeline, fighting crosswinds that threatened to push the helicopter into the rocky mountainside. Through her night vision goggles, she could see SEALs scrambling to clear rocks and debris from the improvised landing zone, working frantically to create enough space for the helicopter's landing gear. 30 seconds on the ground, maximum, she announced. After that, we're taking off whether everyone is loaded or not. As the helicopter touched down on the uneven rocky surface, Sarah felt the landing gear shift and settle. The aircraft was stable for the moment, but she knew that the margin for error was extremely small. One wrong move, or one lucky shot from the enemy, could turn their rescue attempt into a crash. SEALs immediately began carrying wounded personnel toward the helicopter at a dead run. The efficiency of their movements was remarkable, each man knowing exactly what to do without needing detailed instructions. This was the result of years of training and combat experience, and it showed. 15 seconds, Thompson called out, monitoring their position and the approaching enemy forces. More wounded personnel were loaded into the cabin, along with several SEALs who weren't wounded but were helping to care for their injured teammates. Sarah could see through her mirrors that the helicopter was now carrying well beyond its normal capacity, but she also knew that weight limits were guidelines rather than absolute rules in emergency situations. "Time's up," Thompson announced. "We need to go now." But as Sarah began to lift off, she could see that there were still wounded personnel waiting to be evacuated. The sight of injured American soldiers being left behind was almost unbearable, but the alternative was crashing and killing everyone on board. The helicopter lifted off the ridgeline just as another RPG streaked through the space they had occupied seconds before. The enemy was getting better at predicting their movements, which meant that any future rescue attempts would be even more dangerous. The overloaded Black Hawk struggled to gain altitude as Sarah fought against the helicopter's weight limitations and the increasingly violent storm. Lightning was now striking the mountaintops around them regularly, creating brilliant flashes that temporarily blinded her night vision goggles. In the cabin behind her, the crew chief was working frantically to treat 12 wounded SEALs, far more than the aircraft was designed to carry. "Engine temperature is redlining," Thompson reported, his voice tight with concern. "We're asking too much of this bird. She's not going to make it back to base carrying this much weight." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that they couldn't just dump their passengers to save fuel. These men had risked everything on the promise that she would get them to safety, and she wasn't about to break that promise now. "There's a forward aid station about 20 kilometers south of here," she said, checking her tactical display. "It's not much, just a small outpost, but they have medical facilities and we can refuel there." "That outpost is barely defended," Thompson pointed out. "If Taliban forces decide to attack it while we're on the ground, we'll be sitting ducks." "Better than crashing in the mountains," Sarah replied, beginning to turn the helicopter toward the aid station. Behind them, the battle in the Karangal Valley was continuing to rage. Radio transmissions from Lieutenant Commander Morrison indicated that the remaining SEALs were still holding their position, but enemy forces were continuing to build up around them. The armored vehicles that had been spotted earlier were now close enough to engage with their heavy machine guns, adding a new level of danger to the tactical situation. "Bravo 6, this is Wildcard 6, Sarah transmitted. "I've got 12 of your wounded personnel on board, and I'm heading to Forward Aid Station Charlie to drop them off and refuel. I'll be back for another load as soon as possible." Morrison's response was immediate. "Wildcard 6, negative on the return trip. Weather conditions are getting too severe for flight operations. We can see lightning striking all around your position. You need to stay grounded until this storm passes." Sarah looked out at the lightning-filled sky around her helicopter. Morrison was absolutely right that flying in these conditions was extremely dangerous. Lightning strikes could damage electrical systems, navigation equipment, or even the main rotor assembly. But she also knew that waiting for the storm to pass would mean abandoning over 160 Navy SEALs to their fate. "Bravo 6, I'll make that decision when I get to the aid station. Right now, I need you to focus on holding your position until I can get back with reinforcements. Wildcard 6, be advised that we're tracking additional enemy forces moving into the area from the north and east. Our tactical situation is deteriorating rapidly. We may not be able to hold this position much longer." The implication was clear. If Sarah couldn't return quickly with either additional rescue assets or reinforcements, the trapped SEALs would be forced to attempt a fighting withdrawal through hostile territory. Given the numbers they were facing and the terrain they would have to cross, such an attempt would likely result in heavy casualties. Forward Aid Station Charlie appeared through the storm as a collection of small buildings and tents surrounded by defensive barriers. The facility was little more than an advanced first aid post, designed to provide emergency medical treatment and helicopter refueling for special operations forces operating in the area. It wasn't designed to handle 12 critically wounded patients all at once. As Sarah approached the landing pad, she could see medical personnel running from the buildings, alerted by radio transmission about the incoming wounded. The aid station's small medical team would be overwhelmed by the number of casualties, but at least the wounded SEALs would receive proper treatment while Sarah figured out her next move. The helicopter touched down heavily on the aid station's landing pad, the extra weight making the landing more difficult than usual. Before the rotors had even stopped turning, medical personnel were rushing toward the aircraft to begin unloading wounded personnel. "How bad are they?" shouted Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the aid station's chief medical officer, as she approached the helicopter's cabin door. "Multiple gunshot wounds, possible internal injuries, and at least 2 with suspected spinal damage," the crew chief called back. "They've all been stabilized, but they need surgery as soon as possible." Dr. Reynolds began directing her medical team as they carefully unloaded the wounded SEALs from the helicopter. Despite the challenging conditions, the transfer went smoothly, with each wounded man quickly moved to the aid station's small but well-equipped medical facility. While the medical evacuation was taking place, Sarah and Thompson focused on assessing their helicopter's condition and refueling for a return trip to the valley. The aircraft had taken more damage than initially apparent, with bullet holes in the fuselage and damage to several critical systems. "Hydraulic system is running on backup power," Thompson reported as he completed a full systems check. "Radio equipment is partially damaged, and we've got what looks like engine damage from debris ingestion." "Can she make another trip?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected what the answer would be. "Technically, yes, but it would be extremely risky. If any of these damaged systems failed during flight, we'd be in serious trouble." Sarah weighed the risks in her mind. Flying a damaged helicopter back into combat in severe weather conditions violated every safety protocol she had ever learned. But leaving over 160 Navy SEALs trapped behind enemy lines violated every principle of military honor she held dear. Dr. Reynolds approached them as the last of the wounded SEALs was being carried into the medical facility. "Captain Mitchell, I need to speak with you about your passengers." "How are they, Doc?" "They're all going to live, thanks to your actions. But several of them are asking to be allowed to return with you to the valley. They want to rejoin their unit." Sarah was touched, but not surprised by the request. Navy SEALs were trained never to abandon their teammates, and being evacuated while their brothers in arms remained in danger would be difficult for them to accept. "Doc, those men are wounded. They need medical treatment, not another firefight." "I agree completely, but I wanted you to know that they made the request. It says something about the kind of men you just risked your life to save." A new voice interrupted their conversation as Colonel Roberts' voice came over the radio with crystal clarity. The communication problems that had provided convenient cover for Sarah's unauthorized mission were apparently resolved. "Wildcard 6, this is command. You will land immediately and remain on the ground. F-16 fighters are en route to your location to ensure compliance with this order. Any attempt to return to the valley will be considered an act of insubordination and will be dealt with accordingly." Sarah looked at Thompson, who was listening to the radio transmission with a grim expression. "How long before those fighters arrive?" "Maybe 15 minutes in this weather," he estimated, "assuming they can even fly in these conditions." 15 minutes. It would take at least 20 minutes to fly back to the valley, attempt another evacuation, and return to the aid station. The mathematics were impossible. The fighters would intercept them long before they could complete another rescue mission. But as Sarah stood there weighing her options, she noticed something that changed everything. The storm was beginning to move past their position, and the lightning was becoming less frequent. The weather window that she had been hoping for was finally opening up. "Thompson, what if we don't come back here?" she asked quietly. "What if we extract the remaining SEALs and fly directly to the main base? That would require multiple trips, and we'd be operating without authorization the entire time. Plus, we don't know if this aircraft can handle that much additional stress." Sarah walked over to examine the helicopter's exterior damage more closely. The bullet holes were numerous, but mostly superficial, and the engine damage appeared to be less severe than initially thought. Most importantly, the main rotor assembly and flight controls seemed to be unaffected. "Doc, how quickly can you stabilize those wounded SEALs for transport?" she called out to Dr. Reynolds. "They shouldn't be moved again for at least 12 hours. "Why do you ask?" "Because in about 10 minutes, F-16 fighters are going to arrive here with orders to prevent me from returning to that valley. If I'm going to make another rescue attempt, it has to be right now." Dr. Reynolds stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Captain, what you did tonight saved 12 lives. If you think you can save more, then I won't be the one to stop you." Sarah looked at Thompson one more time. "I can't order you to come with me on this one. If we get caught, they'll throw the book at both of us. Court-martial, probably prison time, definitely the end of our careers." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the storm-torn sky, where lightning was still flashing in the distance. Finally, he climbed back into the co-pilot's seat and began starting the helicopter's engines. "Those SEALs didn't abandon their wounded teammates," he said simply. "I'm not abandoning mine." As the Black Hawk lifted off from Forward Aid Station Charlie, Sarah knew that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. She was now officially a rogue pilot, operating without authorization and in direct violation of orders from her commanding officer. But somewhere in the mountains ahead of them, over 160 American warriors were still fighting for their lives, and that was the only thing that mattered. The return flight to the Karengal Valley was a race against time on multiple fronts. Sarah could see the lights of F-16 fighters in the distance behind them, still struggling through the storm, but definitely closing the gap. Ahead of them, the radio chatter from the trapped SEALs indicated that their tactical situation was becoming desperate. "Bravo 6, this is Wildcard 6 returning to your position," Sarah transmitted. "What's your current status?" Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice was strained but steady. "Wildcard 6, we're down to about 40% ammunition. Enemy forces have moved those armored vehicles into position, and they're using heavy machine guns to suppress our defensive positions. We've taken additional casualties, 3 Kia, 7 more wounded, 3 killed in action." Sarah felt a surge of guilt, knowing that if she had been faster with the first evacuation, those men might still be alive. But there was no time for self-recrimination now. The only thing that mattered was getting the survivors out before the situation deteriorated completely. "Bravo 6, I'm going to try a different approach this time. Instead of hovering over your position, I'm going to land in the valley below you, and you're going to have to fight your way down to me." There was a pause before Morrison responded. "Wildcard 6, that valley is completely exposed. The enemy will have clear fields of fire from multiple directions. I know it's risky, but it's the only way we can extract this many personnel quickly. Can your people make it down there?" "Roger, Wildcard 6. If you can suppress those heavy machine guns for about 60 seconds, we can get down there." Sarah looked at Thompson, who was already checking the helicopter's weapon systems. The Black Hawk was equipped with door-mounted machine guns, but using them would require the crew chief and medic to expose themselves to enemy fire. "Chief, can you and the medic handle suppressive fire with the door guns?" Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, the crew chief, checked his equipment and nodded grimly. "We can give them 60 seconds of covering fire, but after that we'll be low on ammunition ourselves. That's all we need. Just keep those heavy guns quiet while the SEALs move to the landing zone." As they approached the valley, Sarah could see the tactical situation clearly for the first time. The SEALs were trapped on a ridgeline about 500 meters above the valley floor, surrounded by Taliban forces who had them pinned down with accurate fire from multiple directions. The armored vehicles that Morrison had mentioned were positioned at the far end of the valley, their heavy machine guns covering the most likely escape routes. "Beginning our attack run," Sarah announced, diving the helicopter toward the valley floor at maximum speed. The door gunners opened fire as they descended, sending streams of tracer rounds toward the enemy positions. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Taliban fighters who had been confidently advancing on the SEAL position suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction, forcing them to seek cover. Sarah flared the helicopter at the last moment, bleeding off speed as she approached the valley floor. The landing was harder than she would have preferred, but the aircraft settled onto the rocky ground without major damage. Through the windscreen, she could see Navy SEALs already beginning their descent from the ridgeline, moving in small groups while providing covering fire for each other. 60 seconds starts now, Rodriguez called out as he continued firing at enemy positions. The first group of SEALs reached the helicopter within 30 seconds, moving with the speed and efficiency that came from years of training. They immediately began establishing a defensive perimeter around the aircraft while waiting for their teammates to reach safety. But the Taliban forces had quickly adapted to this new threat. Sarah could see enemy fighters moving to flank the helicopter's position, while the heavy machine guns on the armored vehicles began traversing to engage the landing zone. "Chief, we need suppressive fire on those vehicles," she called out. "Already on it," Rodriguez replied, shifting his fire toward the armored vehicles. "But these door guns aren't going to do much damage to armored targets." Sarah realized that they needed more firepower than the helicopter's defensive weapons could provide. "Bravo 6, can any of your people engage those armored vehicles with anti-tank weapons?" "Affirmative, Wildcard 6. We've got 2 teams with Javelin missiles moving into position now." The Javelin was a fire-and-forget anti-tank missile that could destroy armored vehicles with a single hit. If the SEALs could take out those vehicles, it would eliminate the biggest threat to the evacuation. More SEALs reached the helicopter, with Lieutenant Commander Morrison among the latest arrivals. As the team leader reached the aircraft, he immediately began organizing the loading of personnel while maintaining communication with his subordinates who were still fighting their way down from the ridgeline. "How many more coming?" Sarah asked. "About 80 still up there, plus we need to recover our dead. No one gets left behind." Sarah understood the principle, but she also understood that recovering bodies under fire would be extremely dangerous and time-consuming. "Commander, we may not have time to recover the Kia. The enemy is repositioning to surround us." Morrison's face was grim but determined. "Captain, those are my men up there. We don't leave anyone behind, living or dead. That's not negotiable." Before Sarah could respond, a massive explosion lit up the valley as one of the armored vehicles disappeared in a ball of flame. The SEAL team with the Javelin missiles had found their target, eliminating one of the primary threats to the evacuation. "One down, one to go," Morrison announced with satisfaction. But the second armored vehicle had learned from its partner's fate and was now maneuvering to present a more difficult target. Its heavy machine gun continued to rake the landing zone with accurate fire, forcing the SEALs to take cover behind rocks and the helicopter itself. Thompson was monitoring the radio traffic from the approaching F-16 fighters. "Sarah, those jets are about 5 minutes out. When they get here, this whole operation is going to shut down." "Then, we need to be gone in 4 minutes," Sarah replied. "How many personnel do we have on board?" "About 60 so far," Rodriguez called out from the cabin. "But we're way over weight limits. I don't think we can take everyone in one lift." Sarah made a quick decision that would either save lives or doom them all. "We're taking everyone. Weight limits be damned." Rodriguez starts stripping out everything non-essential. "Seats, equipment, anything that's not bolted down." "Roger that," Rodriguez replied, immediately beginning to remove unnecessary equipment from the cabin. The second armored vehicle exploded as another Javelin missile found its target. With both heavy machine gun platforms eliminated, the pressure on the SEAL position was significantly reduced. The remaining Taliban fighters were armed only with small arms and RPGs, dangerous but not overwhelming. "All vehicles eliminated," Morrison reported. "My remaining personnel are moving to the landing zone now. But As the last group of SEALs began their descent from the ridgeline, disaster struck. A Taliban fighter with an RPG managed to get close enough to the helicopter to fire at point-blank range. Sarah saw the rocket streaking toward her aircraft and knew there was no time to take evasive action. The RPG struck the helicopter's tailbone, sending shrapnel flying in all directions and causing immediate damage to the tail rotor assembly. Warning alarms began screaming in the cockpit as the aircraft's systems detected the damage. Tail rotor damage, Thompson reported, his voice tight with concern. We've lost partial control authority. I don't know if we can maintain stable flight. Sarah could feel the helicopter beginning to rotate slowly as the damaged tail rotor struggled to maintain directional control. Flying with tail rotor damage was extremely difficult under normal conditions and nearly impossible with an overloaded aircraft in combat conditions. "Can we make it back to base?" she asked. Against all odds, they had successfully extracted 167 Navy SEALs from certain death or capture. The mission that had started with one helicopter pilot's decision to disobey orders had ended with one of the most successful combat rescues in military history. "Wildcard 6, this is command," came Colonel Roberts' voice over the radio. "You are ordered to proceed directly to the main base for immediate landing. F-16 escort will ensure your compliance." Sarah looked at the F-16 fighters now flying alongside her damaged helicopter, their pilots undoubtedly under orders to force her down if she attempted any further unauthorized actions. But the mission was complete. Everyone who could be saved had been saved. "Command, this is Wildcard 6. Proceeding to base as ordered. Mission complete." As the heavily loaded helicopter limped through the Afghan sky towards safety, Sarah knew that her military career was probably over. She would face court-martial charges for disobeying direct orders and possibly prison time, depending on how vindictive her superiors decided to be. But as she looked back at the cabin full of Navy SEALs who were alive because of her decision to ignore those orders, she knew that she had made the right choice. Sometimes doing the right thing required accepting the consequences, and she was prepared to do exactly that. The Black Hawk touched down at the main base just as the sun was rising over the mountains of Afghanistan. As Sarah shut down the engines for what she knew might be the last time, she was immediately surrounded by military police officers waiting to place her under arrest. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stepped out of the helicopter and walked directly to the military police commander. "Colonel, I need to speak with you about Captain Mitchell's actions tonight." "Sir, I have orders to place Captain Mitchell under arrest for disobeying direct orders and conducting unauthorized flight operations." Morrison nodded slowly, then looked directly at the colonel. "Before you do that, I think you should know that Captain Mitchell just completed one of the most heroic rescue missions in the history of special operations. She saved 167 American lives tonight, including mine." Sarah stood quietly as the debate over her fate continued around her. Whatever happened next, she knew that she had done everything possible to bring those SEALs home safely. Sometimes that was all a soldier could do.